If man successfully banishes God from every aspect of human life, who do you think will take his place? This is Encounter. To those who have faith in God, the idea that God is no longer necessary or even harmful is absurd. Yet over the years, this attitude has grown aggressively to the point of becoming dominant. It has invaded all aspects of American life and is the generally accepted norm from the schoolroom to the courthouse. In his topic for today, the Banishment of God, Dr. Zamora demonstrates what a society without God would be like and why we humans will never be able to live successfully without him. Welcome to Encounter.
The lesson human beings have learned or should learn is that life is really a question of faith. Now, those who are not disposed to believe in God would militantly disagree. They do that because they think that faith has to do with only religion. The modern person has learned, so they say, that life is a matter of reason. Faith is a matter of unreasoned emotion. As someone has said, faith is believing what isn't so. Now, whoever uttered those words must not have had the faintest clue on what faith is. Because once a person understands what faith is, it is not difficult to realize the importance of faith to life. You see, true faith is not unreasoned emotion. In fact, faith has to be a rational act if it is to be true faith. True faith essentially is trust. Now follow me. Now if faith as an act is an act of the ignorant and superstitious, then anyone who trusts is ignorant and superstitious, which of course includes the whole human race. Everybody trusts in something or someone. So faith is the act of the will that puts its confidence in its trust in something or someone. Now everyone must decide how life is going to be lived. In other words, how life will be lived in respect to where they put their confidence. Who and what will we trust in? For instance, there are those who trusted in Marx, what he said about life and society. They trusted him enough to place their future in his hands, so to speak. His definition of who man was, what human life was, society and the nature of the universe, it was trusted enough so that they could rely on him. They could place their lives in his hands. Now, we do this every day of our lives. We trust ourselves to someone's view of life and then decide to live in that way. We trust in someone's values. We spend our lives seeking for those values. We live by putting our trust in someone or something, and no one can escape this. Now, I am sure that there are those who would militantly reject such an idea. They would argue in the strongest terms that they trust no one but themselves. But you see, their objection reinforces my point. To trust in one's self, well, it raises a number of questions like, are you trustworthy? Can you be trusted to make the right decisions about life? Do you know enough about the complexity of life to untangle its mystery? Can you be objective enough to decide important issues in life without prejudice, selfishness, hatred, pride? You see, no matter how intelligent, insightful one may be, it really doesn't provide any exemptions for those human imperfections, so that in the last analysis, the question of God is the question of life that has to do with faith. Who and what will we trust in for the definition of life? and how life should be lived.
The title of today's topic, The Banishment of God, would you say the question of faith is fundamental to that? And one more question. Is the attempt to displace God in society, is that the main thrust of the reshaping of our society that's been attempted?
It is, and it is the crucial point. It is very crucial to the subject. You see, to trust in someone takes a great deal of humility. I want to try to explain this. You give up much of your independence and autonomy, which is your self-rule. Now, man is not given to that. He wants to order things by himself. He wants to recognize no other as God but himself. Now, what faith does is that it shatters that myth and it threatens the human ego, you see. So, we have an activity in this society that seeks to displace God from the society. Now, this kind of activity is not new. It began a century before and was given life in the 60s when the church and religion were attacked furiously. Now, I have a copy of a Life magazine that published a special report on what some prominent people in America thought the 20th century would be like. This was around in the 70s when this magazine was published. Gloria Steinman answered that it would be a future without God. Now, it seems inconceivable to many that there would be people who think this way. Radical feminism, and remember that I said radical feminism, has this banishment of God on its agenda. There is a concerted effort to keep deleting God from education. The cry that the Constitution forbids any mention of God in any place of government has served those who do not care for God very well. Even when this is not what the First Amendment says, but it is the judiciary who have been interpreting this amendment in this fashion, which has given the enemies of religion and God an opportunity to do their worst. Now, recently, a dear friend of mine had an experience with a person entering a library and finding calligraphic art on the walls. The annual exhibit of the calligraphic art has never been complained about. This year, someone noticed an artistic piece with beautiful drawn and painted letters, but the words were about God. The man called my friend, who is a member of the Calligraphy Association, and accused her of violating the First Amendment for having this kind of art in a government building, even if it was just a library. So you see, there's always that constant fight. Now, academics have not helped at all either in this area. In fact, it has been academics have been some of the strongest opponents of religion. And it is these academics who teach the teachers of elementary schools and high school and colleges. And then, don't forget the attorneys and judges and doctors and legislators throughout the country and in the halls of Congress. They were taught by these people. So there is a negative toward the values and principles of Christianity and religion. Oh yes, they use religion for political purposes, but in many cases they side with those who don't care too much about religion in a lot of things. You watch television or films and you will see the continuing attack of religion in the church. It is pictured as outdated, anachronistic, and not very honest. Ministers, rabbis, priests, they are all pictured as stupid, dishonest, manipulators, and insincere. Once in a while, a program comes through that is positive about God and religion. But by and large, most of what you see is negative. It is known that the news media has an unspoken rule that avoids religious expression. Their cameras will shift away from spontaneous expressions of faith. This recently happened at the end of the San Francisco Giants game with the Padres. Their victory guaranteed them a place in the playoffs. Now, after the game, the players stood in a circle and prayed. As soon as this happened, which really surprised the cameraman. He switched his cameras away from the players and placed it somewhere else. Now, Ted Turner, at an occasion where he was honored, said to the gathered news people that Christians were losers and that news media people should boycott religion. So it is important that assailing religion has become a kind of an American pastime. It has affected our children and the moral values of our country. Now the revisionists have pictured the founding fathers as antagonistic toward the church and Christianity. These historians are on the search for anything that will give them something by which to assail Christianity. This attitude toward God, Christianity, and religion has altered the values of Americans. It has led people to be indifferent about morality. We no longer have values and principles which can guide us, and we have lost our way.
It's disconcerting when you realize that there's a concerted effort to banish God from our society. And I know how it must make some people feel when they hear something like this, but the problem is that it's true. What will happen if they succeed and banish God from our society completely?
Well, why don't we give some thought to it? Peter Grift, in a contributing essay in the book, Does God Exist?, he raises the question, and I'm going to quote him, "Suppose no one in history had ever conceived of the idea of God. Now rewrite history following that premise. The task daunts and staggers the imagination. From the earliest human remains, religious funeral artifacts, to the most recent wars in the Mideast, religion, belief in God, or in gods, has been the mainstream of the whole watch that is human history." I think he's right. You see, the idea of an actual being who is absolute and perfect and eternal, all-knowing, all-loving, all-just, all-merciful, all-powerful, undying, unchangeable, creator, the very essence of being. It's phenomenal, especially when you start to think that none of us have ever experienced anything that is absolute or anything that is perfect or eternal. How can you think of eternal? You've never seen anything eternal. Now, if God is a fantasy or, say, an invention of man, then it's humanity's masterpiece. You see, the idea of God has guided and altered history. Think of the music, the poetry, philosophy, and other things that have been inspired by the idea of God. Do you know of anything else that has done this? This idea has made a great difference to millions of people on this earth. Without it, there would never have been things accomplished that have made the world a better place. I don't think that a world without God would have been better for it, you know.
It seems strange that now that we know so much about the mystery of the universe, etc., that we should be thinking as a society that God has no place in our world.
Well, I think it's due to man's arrogance. I think that man has come to the place where he thinks he is so bright and fantastic, you know, that this would lead him to do this. He knows how some of the rules of genetics work, so he thinks that no God is needed for the creation of babies. They look up at the universe and are astounded with its mystery and its immensity. They see its ordered design, but then they turn around and say there is no God that is needed for that either. Why? Well, because they've discovered so many of the laws that keep the universe moving, understanding the laws of biology, chemistry, physics. And so it is this knowledge that he has that leads man to think that it makes God unnecessary. And he has taken his place. In other words, science has deified man. So in the future, there will be nothing he cannot do. In a way, he thinks that he will become God then. What a contrast to centuries past. For instance, when you consider the medieval age, you see it as an age of faith. God was more than a cultural thing, a social thing. God was a part of their lives. The church was its source of knowledge, its source of guidance and comfort, so that every aspect of their lives was touched by faith in God. Opponents of religion say that the medieval age is an example of people's bondage to the church and superstition. Now, no one is going to deny the extravagances and abuses that were carried out in the name of religion during this period. But abuse isn't something that is exclusive to religion. Abuse is part of fallen man. You find those kind of abuses in science, law, and medicine. But that time was not devoid of the noble and the good. There were great people. The world needed a St. Francis. He was the product of Christ, for it was his love to Christ that made him who he was and made him do what he did. He was a great man, a saint, truly. And you can name the noble people who followed him. What would England have been without John and Charles Wesley? They tell us that their ministry avoided a revolution like the one that happened in France. And then you think of people like Albert Schweitzer, Mother Teresa, who said she did it all for Jesus. This is what a belief in God does for people who take it seriously, you see.
I have a hard time with the idea that you have to be perfect to be a Christian. Don't you have to measure the value of Christianity by the good that is done? Like those people that you mentioned. They've made a great difference in the lives of thousands, and they've left us a legacy in literature and art and knowledge that's made the world a better place. And it was their faith, wasn't it?
It sure was. In my thinking, I say, take away that faith, like the faith that these people had. Take that away, and what do you have left? Well, you have a social activist who, out of his anger or her anger, try to fashion a world that will not be any better than they are. Now, I don't want to despise their efforts, nor their motives, nor their attitudes, for many of those people have done much for the good of others, but the human heart is deceitful above all things. There is that moral imperative that belief in God it's the only one that can give that imperative. There's that love spoken of and demonstrated by Jesus, who came to be called the Son of God. And that demonstration of love is the greatest catalyst for serving mankind. And I've often wondered what the world would have been like without Jesus. We have to ask, how would we have ever understood love? You see, the Christian concept of love was unknown in the world before Christ. Now, I don't mean that the concept of love did not exist, but Jesus enriched it, and he made it the command for human life, a command that all human beings must take very, very seriously. Now, that's what Jesus does. And as we said, if you have faith in him, if you trust him with your life, then he will make the difference. He will make you productive and creative and helpful. I remember a number of years ago, I was flying out of Washington, D.C. I boarded a plane that began its flight in Boston. I sat by a lady who was the wife of an administrator of a Boston university. When she found out I was a professor of theology, she quite clearly told me that religion was useless. She said that the world's answer was education. Well, I proceeded to remind her that some of the most educated nations had perpetrated some of the worst human cruelties and brutalities in the history of mankind. And these people were educated people. They were doctors and lawyers and professors, and some of the brightest who had taken part in the atrocities, and they did it willingly. So you see, without a moral imperative, I told her, man will always be dubious and dangerous. He will not understand his complexity and the power for evil that he has. So, that, I said, is what belief in God can do, and I emphasize, if you really believe in God and if you really believe in Jesus Christ, it will change you. It'll make you much more productive. Now, we Americans are a good example of a nation that is forgetting God. Now, I don't care how you put it, and there are a lot of individuals who try to argue, but we're not what we could be because God is being left out of the equation. No amount of intellectualism is going to convince me that America was not better when it had a deeper belief in God. There were values that made society better. Now, granted, we had lessons to learn. We learned them, but unfortunately, we are not better people because God is no longer at the center. He makes a great deal of difference. We have never heard of such dishonesties, duplicities in high places. Our leaders are no longer people we can trust. We hear of bribes, of buying favors, of illegalities, of voter fraud, of election rigging. Do we think that believing in God, that believing in man, trusting in man for the answers to life means the salvation for the human race? If you ever wondered if that is possible, look out into the world. Is this the kind of world that doesn't need God? I have to say, how blind can we be? But those who want to believe that it is so will keep on with their nefarious work, their attempt to banish God. We Christians must see that it doesn't happen. In one way, we must exalt Jesus. We must make him the center of our lives and proclaim him as the answer to man's destiny.
In a moment, Dr. Zamora will return with his closing thoughts. Today's study, The Banishment of God, is the last in the four-part series, The Shaping of American Society. This series takes a look at 4 ideas that have shaped American thinking and lifestyles. Much of the ills we face as a nation can be traced to these ideas, which conditioned a generation towards irresponsibility, indifference to morality, and insensitivity to human life. Here again is Dr. Zamora.
This weekend, they are expecting about 1 million men to meet in Washington, D.C. before the Lincoln Memorial to reaffirm their commitment to God and to Jesus Christ. These men are called the Promise Keepers. There will be some new faces, men who have never been to such a meeting before, but they will be there to confess their wrongs, repent, ask God for forgiveness, and change the direction of their lives. Now, many of these men did not live good lives before they became part of this movement of Promise Keepers. They were involved in alcoholism, sexual promiscuity, physical abuse, and some even seriously breaking the law. Some abandoned their wives and children and left them to fend for themselves. Then someone introduced them to Promise Keepers, and their lives were changed. Why? Because for the Promise Keepers, Jesus is important, and to these people who needed help, Jesus became important. He became the center of their lives, and it made them better men. They found there something they had never had before. They went back home to keep the promise they made to God and to Jesus Christ. They went back committed to be better fathers, and better husbands and better neighbors. They brought life and devotion to their families. No more abuse, no more infidelity. Now there is only faithfulness, love, caring and sharing, becoming a help to their wives and a blessing to their families. Now this is what belief in God can do for someone who will take God seriously. Transformations like this are the business that God is in. So what seemed impossible yesterday for a human being becomes a reality today. And the interesting thing about it is that's the way that God works. These people, these men have proven this to be the truth. Now, let all that has happened with the Promise Keepers keep going, and you will see the criticism that will arise. Unfortunately, that criticism is going on right now. Some of the worst critics are the radical feminists, the Now Group. Their virulent attacks have been published by a news media that supports radical feminism. They have accused them of wanting to take women back to the times of slavery. There are others, like women talk show hosts, that ridicule them. This is the attitude of those who are not very keen on the idea of God in society. But you see, we should never become discouraged with this. Jesus himself said that the world would not love him, nor would they love those who followed him. If this much criticism is produced, be assured that Promise Keepers are on the right road. We can take comfort from the fact that they have already begun to make a difference, and it speaks well of anyone who will take Jesus seriously. As he changes people like these men, he can change you. There is no fault, no sin that he cannot take away. There is no life, no matter how useless, that he cannot make new, productive, and fruitful. And all he asks of us is to trust him with our life. Remember, we said that faith is involved with life, that life really involves faith. So what he asks us is to trust him, to place our lives in his hands. And if we do that, we really will assure the future, because there is power in his name. There really is. And if you take him at his word, he will surprise you. And you will see what he can do for you.
Thank you for joining us this half hour. We hope this edition of Encounter has brought you insight and inspiration. Be sure to tune in next week, and until then, may God's joy be with you and your family. Remember, in Christ, life was meant to be lived to the fullest.